The next class of submarine started by the Japanese was the 1,291 surfaced and 1,450 submerged ton I-201 class, also known as the Sen-Taka type. Okay, 200 series. So we have another new type of submarine. Smaller than the giants we're used to. Let's check it out. What the? It's a submarine. Well, it's not a true submarine. That would have to wait for nuclear power. But it's a giant step in that direction anyway, rather than the cartoon villain-esque abominations they've been building. Where are the British documentary hosted by that old guy in a flat cap and a tweed jacket talking about these? Is it because they're not carnival freak shows? Okay, let's calm down and back up a minute here. In the late 30s, the Japanese built an experimental small submarine known as the 71 Go. It was meant to test the feasibility of a submarine with a then very high submerged speed, and it succeeded, getting up to a then astonishing 21 knots submerged. Unfortunately, it couldn't do it very long, still had to surface to recharge its quickly depleted batteries, and was barely controllable. So it was scrapped even before the war started, which is why it didn't get its own video. The idea was revolutionary rather than evolutionary, but Japan simply lacked the technological base to make it work. Enter the German technology transfers. German engineers had already begun working on the Types 21 and 23 U-boats, and some of that R&D found its way to Japan. These were the pieces the Japanese needed to finish the puzzle. So, in March 1944, the project to build a fast submerged submarine was restarted, using those borrowed innovations. Electric welding was used in their construction, along with being built in prefabricated sections. Combined with thicker and better steel, this gave them deeper maximum diving depth, though still behind Western types. A new German-inspired design for their motors made a high submerged speed of 19 knots for an hour physically possible. This made them the fastest submerged submarines of the war. Though, of course, they were about as quiet as a freight train at that speed, so no one listening on sonar could miss them, and then once their batteries started to die, they were going to be slowing down one way or another. At a lower speed, they could cruise underwater for much longer, which was actually more practical. Part of the reason for this was because of their batteries. While most American submarines had 252 cells, the I-201s had over 4,000. Now their batteries weren't as efficient as U.S. batteries, but again, brute force. To help reach this submerged speed, and like their German counterparts, their hulls were much more streamlined. Their conning tower was much smaller than previous subs in terms of length, width, and height. This also helped them be harder to detect on the surface. They also sacrificed a heavy deck gun. Light anti-aircraft guns were carried, but these were in retractable hideaway mounts to streamline them. They also were completed with the Type 22 surface search radar. This wasn't winning any awards, but it was a step in the right direction. Another thing that helped them on the surface was that their ballast tanks sat much higher in the outer hull. This meant they sat much lower in the water, which made them hard to detect on the surface. It also helped them dive much faster. Arguably, the most important innovation was the adoption of a snorkel. It was functionally crude compared to German or Dutch snorkels, but it got the job done. Now they didn't even have to surface to recharge their batteries and change out the air. Finally, to help make them harder to detect with active sonar, they were covered in a rubber coating meant to absorb active sonar pulses. Again, It wasn't as efficient as German sound absorbent material, but it was a step in the right direction. So, in summary, they had some serious flaws. Submerged, they were loud and thus easy to hear. Living conditions were not good. Their sonar wasn't very good. Their radar wasn't very good. As such, their ability to track targets and thus establish a fire control solution submerged was poor. They still had to use the periscope. That being said, they were a step in the right direction and were without question the best Japanese submarines of the war, if not arguably some of the best subs in the world. If Japan had built these pre-war instead of the kaiju boats and unleashed them against the American fleet trains, they could have been a serious problem. But they came too late, only entering service in 1945. While a dozen had been planned, only 8 were actually started, and only 3 were actually completed. None operationally deployed, so there is no combat history to review. Post-war, like the other Japanese submarines, they were studied by the Americans, who quickly identified them as knockoffs of German tech, and they were scuttled. These guys, I can actually believe the U.S. scuttled rather than take the chance of them falling into the Soviet hands.